When you're shooting video on a DSLR camera, you have the option to shoot with a variety of different lenses. When it comes to understanding the differences between these lenses, probably the most important thing to consider is focal length. Focal length is defined as the distance between the middle of the lens and its focal point when focused on a subject at infinity. Well, that's great, but what does that mean in practical terms? Here we have a subject being shot with a 50mm lens. Lenses are defined by their focal length. The focal length is always stated in millimeters. As a rule of thumb, the greater the focal length of a lens, the more magnified an image will be, and the more narrow its angle of view will be. You can see in this second shot coming up that we have a wider angle of view of our subject and a less magnified image than before. Even though our camera and our subject have stayed physically in the same position, what we have changed is we've switched our lens from a 50mm to a wider 35mm. And in this next shot, we're using a 20mm lens now, and you can see that our angle of view has widened dramatically, so much so that we're even starting to see the light sticking out of the top left corner there. And the subject is even less magnified than before. Finally, if we go from a 20mm lens to an even wider 10mm lens, the angle of view has widened so much that we can see nearly the entire room. The subject appears to be much farther away than in previous shots, and yet remember, our camera and subject haven't moved an inch from the earliest example. So, lenses and their different focal lengths offer variations in magnification and angle of view. Telephoto lenses, that's the higher focal length lenses that bring you closer to your subject, are generally good for getting shallower depth of field, making it easy for you to blur your background while keeping your subject in focus. Wide-angle lenses are great for when you're working in tight spaces and want to shoot close to your subject without being stuck on his lips and nose hairs. You might have heard of the terms prime lens and zoom lens before. This basically refers to whether your lens operates at one fixed focal length or if it can be adjusted to several different focal lengths. A prime lens has a fixed focal length. The 50mm I have here does not zoom in or out. It does 50mm and only 50mm. The lens on my right, which is actually the kit lens for the Canon T2i, is an 18 to 55mm lens. It's a zoom lens which can be set to any practical focal length between 18mm and 55mm. You can set which focal length the lens will behave as by turning the black ring left or right. A good thing to keep in mind is that there are limitations to both prime lenses and zoom lenses. The obvious limitation to a prime lens is that it's stuck at one focal length. Zoom lenses, however, tend to be slower than primes, meaning their f-stops don't go as low as primes. We'll explain more about f-stops and aperture in a later video. Probably the biggest advantage of a zoom lens, though, is that it gives a new user the chance to experience many different focal lengths without having to actually swap out lenses. When you're shooting, try to make a note of what focal lengths you prefer shooting at and when.